My mother-in-law called my hospital, pretended to be my mother, and canceled my birth registration so I'd deliver at her house. The only thing she delivered that day was consequences. My mother-in-law, Darlene, decided she was in charge of my pregnancy about 6 minutes after I announced it. We told the family at Sunday dinner. My husband Nico squeezed my hand under the table, and before the congratulations finished going around, Darlene had already started listing what was going to happen. Not asking, listing. She said I'd be delivering at her house because every baby in the family for 3 generations had been born at home, and that wasn't going to change because of me. She said it exactly like that. Because of me. Like I was a scheduling conflict and not the person growing the actual child. I told her I'd spoken to my OB, and I was delivering at the hospital. She looked at me like I'd said something in another language. Then she looked at Nico and said, and I remember this word for word. It's not just your baby. It belongs to this family. Not it belongs to you and your husband. It belongs to this family. My unborn child was a family asset and I was the container. Nico said nothing. He squeezed my hand again, which I later realized was his version of conflict resolution. He did it every single time his mother steamrolled me, and not once did he open his mouth. Darlene spent the next 4 months acting like the hospital plan didn't exist. She converted her guest bedroom into a birthing room. Plastic sheets on the mattress, towels stacked on a shelf, a lavender diffuser in the corner because she'd read somewhere that lavender helps with labor. She described it to me at lunch the way someone describes a nursery they've been dreaming about for years. I told her again I was going to the hospital. She waved her hand and said, we talk about it later. We never talked about it later because for Darlene there was no conversation to have. She decided. At my baby shower, which she organized without asking me, she announced to 40 people that the baby would be born at home the way God intended. 2 of her friends came up to me afterward and told me how lucky I was to have a mother-in-law who cared so much. I was 7 months along when I found out what she'd done. I called the hospital to confirm my pre-registration, and the woman on the phone told me it had been canceled. I asked when. She said 3 weeks ago. I asked by who. She said a woman who identified herself as the patient's mother had called and said the birth plan had changed to a home delivery, and the registration was no longer needed. She did that. She called my hospital, pretended to be my mother, and canceled my registration, so I would have no choice but to deliver the baby in her lavender guest room. I sat in my car in a grocery store parking lot for about 15 minutes after that call. I didn't cry. I just sat there with the engine off and watched a man load groceries into his trunk and thought about how strange it was that someone could do that to me and the world outside kept going. The cart corral was full. A woman was buckling a toddler into a car seat 2 spaces over. The radio was playing something soft I couldn't make out. I kept thinking the word she'd used, that the woman on the phone had used. Mother. Someone had said the word mother and meant Darlene. Then I drove home, re-registered at the hospital using my own phone, and added a password to my file so that no one could make changes without it. I didn't confront Darlene. I didn't tell Nico, because I knew if I told him, he would squeeze my hand and say he'd talk to her, and then he'd talk to her, and she'd cry, and he'd feel guilty, and I'd end up being the problem again. So I waited. 3 weeks before my due date, Darlene called to tell me she'd hired a midwife, a woman named Sandy who'd delivered babies for 20 years and who would be on call at Darlene's house starting the following week. Darlene said the midwife cost $3,000 and that she'd paid out of her own pocket as a gift. A $3,000 gift I never asked for to fund a birth plan I never agreed to in a house that wasn't mine. I told her she should get a refund. She said that wasn't funny. I said I wasn't joking. She told me to stop being selfish because it wasn't just my baby. Those words again. My water broke on a Thursday at 2 a.m. Nico drove me to the hospital. He called his mother from the waiting room, and 45 minutes later, she showed up in her bathrobe and tried to come into the delivery room. The nurse told her only my designated support person was allowed in during delivery, and I listed my older sister B. Not Nico, not Darlene. B. Darlene looked at Nico and told him to fix this. Nico looked at me. I looked at the nurse. The nurse looked at Darlene and told her to wait in the lobby. She paced that lobby for 11 hours. I know because B's husband Cosmo was out there too. And he told me later that Darlene asked every nurse who walked past when she could come in, and every one of them told her the same thing. She'd be called when the patient was ready. My daughter, Aurora, was born at 1:47 p.m. 6 pounds 9 ounces. Healthy. B held her first, then Nico. Then my father-in-law Victor, who had arrived quietly that morning and sat in the lobby without once asking to come in. I let 4 more people in after that. My best friend Kaylee, Cosmo, my cousins Cheryl and Plato, who'd been waiting since dawn. Darlene was the 12th. She walked into that room after everyone else had already taken their turn. She looked at the baby and then looked at me, and I could see she wanted to say something, but she couldn't, because 12 people had been let in before her and every one of them knew it. She held the baby for about 3 minutes. She didn't say much. The first 2 days home were quiet. Nico was right there, changing diapers, bringing me water while I nursed, sitting next to me on the couch at 3 a.m. when Aurora wouldn't stop crying for no reason. B came by with baked pasta and held Aurora for an hour while I took an actual shower. Darlene didn't call, didn't text, didn't show up, just silence. Part of me sat on the couch with my daughter on my chest and let myself believe the hospital had been enough, that she'd gotten the message, almost. Day 3 is when it started. Nico came home from work and didn't kiss me. He went straight to the sink, washed his hands, picked up Aurora from her swing, and sat in the recliner staring at the wall. I made dinner and he ate it without really saying anything. I asked him about his day and he gave me an answer that sounded like words, but didn't say anything. I put my fork down and asked what was wrong. He didn't answer right away. He adjusted Aurora in his arms, even though she was fine. He looked at the table, then the fridge, then the floor, anywhere but at me. Then he said, "My mom called me at work today. She was crying so hard she couldn't breathe. She told him she'd been publicly humiliated in front of the entire family, that she was treated like a stranger at the birth of her own grandchild, that she had paid $3,000 out of her own pocket, and it was thrown back in her face like it was nothing." I asked him what he'd said to her. Long pause. Then he said, "I told her I'd talk to you." There it was. Not, "I'd handle it." Not, "I told her she was wrong. He'd talk to me." His mother had called a hospital pretending to be someone she's not, and I was the one who needed to be talked to. I asked him if she'd told him about that part, about calling the hospital and pretending to be my mother. His whole face changed. Not angry, not guilty, blank. Like I'd said something that didn't fit in any category his brain had. He said, "What are you talking about?" He genuinely didn't know, so I told him all of it. The phone call to confirm my registration, the cancellation, the woman who'd claimed to be my mother, the re-registration in a parking lot, the password on my file. I told him his mother committed fraud. I used that word on purpose. Nico sat down slowly on a kitchen chair. He didn't reach for my hand. He didn't squeeze anything. He sat there with his elbows on his knees and his head slightly forward, like someone had put something heavy on his back. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said it. "She wouldn't do that." 4 words. Every one of them felt like a door closing. He didn't say, "Are you sure?" He didn't say, "That's crazy." He said she wouldn't do that, like I was making it up. Like I had invented a story about his mother calling my hospital and pretending to be someone else because, what? I wanted drama 2 days after giving birth. I got up without saying anything, walked into our bedroom, opened my bedside drawer, and pulled out the printed call log I'd requested 2 months ago and kept under a book like insurance. I put it on the table in front of him. The date, the time, the duration, the hospital's own notes. Caller identified herself as the patient's mother and requested cancellation of the birth registration. He picked it up. He read it once, slowly. Then he read it again. He put it down on the table and pressed his fingers against it, like he was trying to feel whether it was real. Then he said, "I need to think." He picked up Aurora, carried her into the nursery, and closed the door behind him. I heard the rocking chair creak. I sat at the table and looked at that closed door, and I realized something I'd been avoiding for a long time. Nico wasn't neutral. There's no such thing as neutral when someone does what Darlene did. Neutral is a side, and it wasn't mine. The next morning, my cousin Cheryl called. It wasn't a "how's the baby" text. It was a "we need to talk" text. And those 3 words at 8 a.m. told me Darlene had started dialing. Cheryl said she'd gotten a really long phone call from Darlene the night before. She told me Darlene had said I banned her from the delivery room and made her sit in the hallway for 11 hours while strangers held the baby. Strangers. The people who'd been in that room, my sister, my best friend, my cousins, were strangers because they weren't her. I told Cheryl the truth, and then I told her about the hospital, about the canceled registration. Cheryl didn't hesitate. That woman called me crying about being disrespected, and she did that? 2 hours later, Plato called. Same story, plus a new addition, that I was keeping Aurora from her, that she'd been begging to see her grandchild, and I was shutting her out. I told him she hadn't called me once since we came home. Not one time. He believed me. 2 cousins down. But the people who mattered in Darlene's campaign weren't my cousins. They were Nico's family. The aunts, the cousins, the grandmother, the people who'd known Darlene their whole lives and had no reason to question her. Those were the ones I couldn't reach. That evening, Nico came home and told me his mother was having a family dinner on Sunday. His parents, his aunt, 2 of his cousins, his grandmother, a room full of people who had gotten phone calls from Darlene over the past week. A table set not for dinner, but for a performance. He told me she just wanted everyone together. It wasn't about us. I said, "Everything she does is about us. You just pretend it isn't." He picked up Aurora and turned on the TV. After he went to bed, I called Kaylee. I laid out everything. The crying call to Nico. The "she wouldn't do that" moment. The call log he'd read twice and then walked away from. The cousins. The Sunday dinner. Kaylee listened to all of it without cutting in once, which is not like her. When I finished, she said, "You're going to that dinner, right?" I said I hadn't decided. She said, "If you don't show up, she controls the story. You walk in there and you tell the truth and you let them decide." Later, B texted that she and Cosmo were coming. I hadn't asked. She said, "I was there. I saw everything. I'm not letting her rewrite it." I made my decision in the dark next to my sleeping husband. I was going. The morning of the dinner, I packed the diaper bag the way I always did. Diapers, wipes, a change of clothes, a pacifier, a blanket, and at the bottom I put the folder, the printed call log, screenshots of every text where Darlene talked about the home birth like it was a done deal, the texts mentioning Sandy being on call starting Monday, the text about the birthing room being ready, 7 months of receipts. About halfway there, Nico looked at me in the rearview mirror and said, "Please, just keep things calm tonight." I told him I wasn't the one who'd been calling people and lying. He didn't say anything back. He just drove. He wasn't asking his mother to keep things calm. He was asking me. Victor opened the door before Nico could knock. He took Aurora into his arms and held her like she was made of glass and said, "She's beautiful." That was it. He didn't bring up the hospital or the phone calls or any of it. The living room was full. Nico's aunt by the window, 2 of his cousins on the couch with glasses in their hands, his grandmother in the corner chair with a blanket across her lap, small and sharp-eyed and watching everything the way she always did. The house smelled like roasted garlic. There were platters already out on the dining table. Darlene had been cooking all day. This was a production. Then Darlene came around the corner from the kitchen wearing an apron over a nice dress, hair done, makeup perfect, looking like a woman hosting a dinner party and not a woman who'd spent the week crying on the phone. She pulled me into a big, warm, 2-armed hug, the kind that's meant to be seen, and announced to the room, "My grandbaby is here. My grandbaby." Like Aurora was hers. The 2 cousins on the couch looked at me. I recognized that look right away. It's the look you give someone when you've already heard the story and you're watching to see if the person matches what you were told. 20 minutes later, B and Cosmo walked in with a covered dish, then Kaylee with a pie, then Cheryl and Plato. I watched Darlene notice. Her smile got tighter. "Oh, I didn't know you were coming. I would have made more food." B smiled at her, easy and calm, and said, "I wouldn't miss it." Those 4 words just hung there. Darlene went back to the bread. We sat down to eat and Darlene ran that table the way she runs everything, completely. She decided who sat where without saying it. She served the plates herself. She talked about Aurora nonstop, how she looked like Nico as a baby, how she already had the family chin. Then she said it, aimed at the whole table, and not at me. I want Aurora here every weekend so she knows her grandmother's house. Not a question, an announcement. The same way she told me I was delivering the baby at her house. I ate my food and said nothing. I knew what was coming. Halfway through dinner, dinner, she put her fork down. Her voice went soft. I just want everyone to know that I wasn't allowed in the room when my own granddaughter was born. Her voice cracked perfectly on the word granddaughter. I sat in a hallway for 11 hours. People I've never met held my grandbaby before I did. One of Nico's cousins shook her head slowly. His grandmother put a thin hand on Darlene's arm and patted it gently. The room tipped. Every eye turned to me, the way a jury looks at someone after the prosecution finishes talking, waiting for me to apologize, waiting for me to explain myself. I set my fork down, calmly. Darlene, do you want to tell them why you weren't in the room, or should I? A little flicker crossed her face. She straightened up and said, I was told I wasn't welcome. That's all there is to it. The perfect victim sentence. Short enough to stick, vague enough to hide behind. I looked right at her and said, that's not all there is to it, and you know that. Nico's hand landed on my arm. He leaned in and whispered, not here. I turned and looked at him, my husband, the man who had squeezed my hand at 100 dinners instead of opening his mouth, the man who took our newborn into a nursery and closed the door because he needed to think about whether his mother committing fraud was a problem. I said, yes, here, because she made it here. She called everyone in this room and told her version. Now they get to hear mine. Nico pulled his hand off my arm. The room went silent. I said, 7 months ago, you called my hospital, pretended to be my mother, and canceled my birth registration so I'd have no choice but to deliver the baby in your guest room. Darlene's mouth opened and closed. That's not what happened. I said, then explain the call log from the hospital that shows someone identifying themselves as my mother called and canceled my file 3 weeks before you hired Sandy. I reached into the diaper bag, pulled out the folder, opened it, and set the printed call log on the table between the bread basket and the salad bowl. The date, the time, the hospital's own notes. Then I took out the screenshots one at a time. The text from Darlene saying Sandy was on call starting Monday, everything is set. The text saying the birthing room was ready, fresh sheets put on today. Both sent after the registration had been canceled behind my back. The papers sat on that table and every person could see them. You didn't give me a gift, I said. You tried to take away my choice. You impersonated my mother to a hospital so you could force me to give birth in your house. Darlene turned to Nico with that direct, urgent, do something stare that had worked on him his entire life. But Nico wasn't looking at her. He was staring at the call log the same way he had in our kitchen days ago, reading and rereading it. Victor, at the end of the table, picked up his napkin, folded it once, and set it down next to his plate. He didn't say a word, but his face was the face of a man who had stayed quiet for a very long time and who was looking at the reason he should have spoken up a lot sooner. Darlene pushed her chair back a few inches and put both hands flat on the table. I did what I thought was best for the baby. The hospital isn't safe. Home births are natural. I was trying to protect my grandchild. I let her finish. Then I said, you didn't try to convince me. You didn't ask me. You called a hospital and lied about who you were. That's not protection. That's control. One of Nico's cousins, the same one who'd been shaking her head in sympathy minutes earlier, reached across the table and picked up the call log. She read it slowly. Then she set it down without a word, folded her hands in her lap, looked at her plate, and did not look at Darlene again. Not once. Then Nico's grandmother spoke. She'd been studying the log from her chair, finger tracing the lines. She looked up at Darlene and said, Darlene, did you really call that hospital and say you were this girl's mother? The question hit the room like a brick going through a window. This wasn't me asking. This wasn't some daughter-in-law she could dismiss as dramatic or ungrateful. This was the grandmother, the woman whose approval Darlene had spent decades trying to earn. Darlene's mouth opened. She closed it. She swallowed. Then she said, I was desperate. She was shutting me out. She was taking my son and my grandbaby away from this family. Her voice broke on the word family. The grandmother looked at her with those sharp, steady eyes and said, nobody was taking anything. You were pushing. 6 words. Darlene's face changed in a way I had never seen before. Not the controlled expressions, not the performances. Something behind her eyes cracked open. Then Victor stood. I heard the chair push back before I saw him. He walked around the table, past Nico, past B, past Kaylee, and stopped right next to me. He put his hand on my shoulder. He said, I'm sorry. I should have said something months ago. His voice was low and steady, and I could tell those words had been sitting in him for a long time. I looked up and nodded because I didn't trust my voice. Then he turned his head to Darlene, his wife, and said, you went too far. You know you did. Darlene stared at him, pure, unfiltered shock. She had planned for me to be the enemy. She had planned for Nico to stay quiet. She had not planned for Victor. She turned to Nico, her last card. Nico, are you going to sit there and let them do this to me? Her voice was tight and high, and there was something desperate in it, like a person grabbing for a rope they're not sure will hold. Nico looked at her for a long time. Then he said, Mom, you pretended to be someone else and tried to cancel a medical registration. I read the paper. I don't know what you want me to say. His voice wasn't loud. It was tired. The kind of tired that comes from finally saying something you should have said a long time ago. Darlene leaned across the table. I want you to defend your mother. And Nico, the man who had spent 9 months choosing silence, who had closed a nursery door because he needed to think about whether fraud was a problem, looked at her and said, I have a daughter now. I'm defending her mother. Darlene stood up. The chair scraped against the floor. She looked around the table one more time, face by face, looking for one person who would give her what she needed. Nico's cousins looked at their plates. His aunt sipped her wine. The grandmother didn't move. Victor was still standing next to me. There was no one. She pressed her lips together and walked out of the dining room and into the kitchen. She didn't slam a door. She didn't say anything. She just left. Victor squeezed my shoulder once and walked back to his end of the table. He picked up his napkin, put it back in his lap, and looked at his plate like a man who had just set something down he'd been carrying for too long. B reached over and found my hand. When Nico squeezed my hand, it meant please don't make this harder for me. When B did it, it meant I'm here and I'm not going anywhere. Same gesture, different language. I lifted Aurora out of the carrier and held her against my chest. She was warm. She made a small sound when I brought her close, the kind babies make when they feel safe. The lavender diffuser was still running down the hall. I could smell it faintly, drifting from the room with the plastic sheets and the stacked towels and the fresh linens she had texted me about. That room was just a guest room now. The food on my plate was getting cold. A car passed outside. Someone passed the bread.